Between 1853 and 1854, 9 white overseers vanished without a trace from the plantations of Burke County, Georgia. Official records said they'd moved west, but deep in the swamps, men whispered a different story. They spoke of screams that bled through the cypress trees, and of a pale figure gliding through the darkness, silent, deliberate, unstoppable. They called him Devil's White. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a myth. He was an enslaved man, a man whose skin burned in the sun, whose silence became a weapon, and whose vengeance turned into legend. The truth was buried under a century of fear and denial. But tonight, we're going to dig it up, because history didn't forget Silas. It hid him, and once you know what he did, you'll understand why Georgia's swamps still whisper his name after 170 years. Before we wade into this nightmare, hit subscribe if you love true stories that feel too dark to be real. It helps more people find tales buried under the mud of history. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? The last time we told a story from the Deep South, half our audience had family roots there. Maybe yours does too. All right, take a deep breath. Let's begin. The year was 1853. Dawn crept across the Georgia swamps like a wounded animal, low and heavy. Mist clung to the cypress roots, swallowing sound and light alike. Men stirred, chains clinked. By the time the first overseer's whip cracked, the rice fields were already alive with motion. Bare backs bent, muscles shivering under the morning chill. The air smelled of mud, sweat, and iron. But one man worked slower. Too slow. His name was Silas, 28 years old, skin pale as wax, eyes the color of storm water. Even under the weak dawn, his flesh reddened and peeled. He squinted constantly, blinking against pain that never stopped. When he first arrived, the men in the quarters didn't know what to make of him. An albino slave was a curse, they said, a bad omen. Some crossed themselves when he passed, muttering prayers under their breath. The overseers didn't bother with prayers. They laughed. Wade Parsons, a young overseer with tobacco-stained teeth, called him Ghost Boy, said he looked like something the devil spat out half-finished. The laughter came easy, cruel, and constant. Silas didn't answer. He never did. He just worked, slow but steady, hands blistering, back bleeding where the whip had kissed him days before. He didn't scream then either. Not once. That silence unsettled even the cruelest of them. By the third week, they'd already beaten him twice. The first was for working too slow, the second for looking wrong at Parsons. Both times, he took the lashes without sound, without flinch, like a man carved from bone. At night, when the others whispered by the fire, Silas sat apart. He rubbed at the scars with water from a tin cup, eyes distant. The others watched, pretending not to. He frightened them, but not for what he said, only for what he didn't. Greer, the head overseer, noticed that silence. To him, silence meant defiance. It meant something inside the man hadn't been broken yet, and Greer hated unfinished work. So he made Silas his special project. Every morning, Greer would call him out. "Ghost!" he'd shout. "You see that field? That's yours. Finish it or I'll finish you." His voice carried over the swamp, sharp and certain. Silas just nodded, slow, quiet, almost calm. By noon, his skin blistered so bad the pus oozed down his arms. The heat bit at him, the sun carving red welts where other men merely tanned. Still he worked. Still he said nothing. The others watched in silence too. That night, one of the older men, a carpenter named Ezra, finally spoke to him. "You keep quiet long enough," Ezra said. "They think you plotting." Silas looked up from his bowl of cornmeal. "Maybe I am," he said softly. Ezra froze. The words were simple, but something in his tone made the air shift. A murmur ran through the cabin. It wasn't fear exactly. It was something heavier, something like expectation, and from that night, No one sat too close to Silas. Weeks bled into months. The cold came. The work changed shape, but not cruelty. The men carried logs instead of rice, their hands raw and split. Silas's pale skin cracked until his blood looked black under moonlight. One evening, Greer stood watching him from the levee, arms crossed. "Ain't no man last long like that," he muttered. "He'll break soon." But he didn't. He kept moving like the pain belonged to someone else, like he'd already left his body behind. Late one night, Silas disappeared for the first time. The men noticed because the air changed when he wasn't there. Ezra saw him return hours later, barefoot, clothes wet up to his knees. "Where you go?" Ezra whispered. "Nowhere," Silas said. But the swamp told stories. Some men said they heard something moving in the dark water that night. Not gators, not men, just movement, slow, careful, like the earth itself was learning to breathe again. When the overseers counted heads the next morning, they didn't notice. Greer thought he'd been there all along. Silas worked the same, slow and quiet, but the look in his eyes had changed. Colder, steadier. Something had settled inside him. Then came the frost. Men died that winter from fever and rot. Greer didn't care. He replaced them like tools. "We lose a few, we buy a few," he'd say. "Ain't nothing personal." To him, nothing ever was. One night in December, the men gathered for their single day of rest, the Christmas break. Greer was drunk. The air smelled of fire and cheap whiskey. Laughter echoed from the big house, but in the quarters, there was silence again. Silas sat near the doorway, sharpening a blade he'd found, rusted, dull, but enough. Delilah, the cook's mother, watched from the shadows. "Boy," she said softly, "you thinking dangerous thoughts." He didn't look up. "Only true ones," he replied. She stared at him, long and sad. "You can't fight what owns the sky," she said. "Ain't no winning against men born to kill." Silas smiled faintly. "Then maybe it's time something else did the killing." The room fell quiet. Even the fire stopped popping. Outside, the swamp wind rose and rattled the shutters. It sounded like breath, or maybe warning. But Silas didn't flinch. He just kept sharpening. Long strokes, careful rhythm. When the night ended, the men slept uneasy. Some dreamed of blood, others of freedom. Silas didn't dream at all. He just waited for dawn, eyes open, blade cold against his palm. By morning, Greer was pacing again. "Tomorrow," he said to his men, "we start the deep field. Make them work till their backs split." His voice was thick with whiskey and ego. No one argued. Silas heard him from the doorway. He didn't react, didn't speak. But something in his breathing changed. Slow, deliberate, measured. Like a man counting backward to something inevitable. That night, he left again. No one saw him go, no one dared follow. The swamp swallowed his pale figure whole, and the sound of frogs and water filled the silence he left behind. Hours later, a whip cracked somewhere in the dark. Once, twice, then silence again. Ezra turned in his sleep, uneasy, but didn't wake. When morning came, the sound was gone, replaced by the low hum of insects over the marsh. By breakfast, everyone knew something had shifted. The dogs barked more. The air smelled wrong, sharp, metallic, faintly sweet. And Greer's voice carried farther than usual, sharp with suspicion. "Where's Parsons?" he shouted. No one answered. Silas worked like always, head bowed. When the overseers passed, he didn't look up. But for the first time since he arrived, a smile touched his cracked lips. Small, almost invisible. Like he'd finally remembered something worth living for. The swamp was still that morning, quieter than usual. Even the birds stayed hidden. And far to the north, where the cypress grove met the black water, something pale moved between the trees. Slowly, patiently, purposefully. The first disappearance was only hours away, and the legend of Devil's White was about to begin. Morning came thick with fog. The air hung heavy over the fields like smoke. Overseer Wade Parsons was gone, and no man could explain why. His bed lay untouched, his boots by the door. Thomas Greer stood on the porch, staring toward the swamp. He chewed the inside of his cheek, thinking. Parsons was no coward. He'd whipped men for blinking wrong, for breathing too loud. Now, nothing but silence answered his name. The other overseers gathered, 6 of them each with their own brand of fear. They tried to laugh, to joke about drunken wandering, but no one's voice rang right. No one believed their own lies. Greer called for the hounds. The dogs sniffed the ground near the edge of the cypress grove, then whimpered and refused to go farther. Their tails dropped. One even backed away, growling low, like something unseen had frightened it. Silas worked the fields as usual. He didn't glance up when Greer's boots passed him by. Sweat burned through his blisters. His eyes watered in the light. But inside, a stillness deeper than sleep had settled. The men whispered that night in the quarters. "Maybe he ran," one said. "Maybe gators took him." Another spat into the dirt. "Maybe something else took him, something white." The words floated like smoke between the bunks. Silas sat alone again. He was always alone, his face half hidden in shadow, hands resting on his knees. He didn't speak, didn't move. But his breathing matched the rhythm of the swamp, slow, deliberate, eternal. By dawn, Greer had ordered a search. 4 overseers and 8 enslaved men moved through the marsh with torches and rifles. The swamp swallowed sound, turning their voices into muffled echoes. No one wanted to lead. Hours later, they returned with nothing but mud up to their waists and fear in their eyes. No tracks, no blood. Just still water and strange marks in the soft earth. Too large for a man. Too small for an animal. Greer slammed his hat onto the table. "He's drunk, lost, or dead. Either way, we move on." But his voice trembled just enough for his men to hear. Power cracks easy when fear starts whispering. For 3 weeks, the plantation crawled under a new kind of silence. Work continued, but the rhythm broke. Every rustle of leaves made men glance over their shoulders. Even Greer kept a pistol close now. Then, another morning, another man gone. Daniel Carmichael, youngest of the overseers, eager to please. His breakfast plate sat untouched. His rifle leaned neatly against his chair. Greer's jaw clenched hard enough to ache. This time, they searched all day. The dogs refused again. The men waded waist-deep through black water that smelled of rot. They found a broken branch, a torn sleeve, and nothing more. Night came early in those swamps. The frogs sang, the air dripped, and deep in the grove, something pale moved just beneath the mist, watching from between the trees. No one saw it, not clearly, but it saw them. Greer stopped pretending calm. He doubled the night patrols, posted guards at the quarters, and ordered every enslaved man accounted for after sunset. "No one breathes wrong without me knowing," he said, voice cracking. The men obeyed. They always did. But fear spread faster than obedience. Even the strongest among them whispered that the swamp was cursed, and the curse had skin, white as bone, cold as death. Silas worked on, unmoved. He had begun speaking again. Small words, quiet sentences. When another man asked him what he thought of the vanishings, he simply said, "The swamp remembers." Then he went back to work. Greer didn't sleep much anymore. He dreamed of movement in the dark, of shapes half seen through mist. When he woke, he'd find sweat soaking his shirt, and the night outside too quiet to trust. By mid-March, 2 more men disappeared. Robert Finch and George Talbot, both on the same night. Their rifles were found leaning against a cypress trunk, placed neatly, like someone had arranged them with care. Now the plantation shook with panic. Overseers refused to work alone. Even the enslaved men avoided eye contact. Fear became its own overseer, invisible but absolute. Greer carried his rifle everywhere, even to eat. He wrote to Calhoun in Savannah. The letter trembled with false calm. Missing men, possible runaways, situation contained. But the ink smeared where his hand had shaken. He sealed it anyway. Lies were cheaper than truth. At the quarters, the men didn't sing anymore. Even the fire burned quieter. Ezra sat near Silas and whispered, "You hear it at night? That sound in the trees?" Silas nodded once. "It's learning their names." Greer's orders turned crueler. Fewer rations, longer hours, more lashes, as if pain could smother fear. But each beating only made the air heavier, thicker, more alive. The swamp itself seemed to listen. On the seventh night, a scream split the darkness. Not an overseer's call, not a gator's bellow. A human scream, high, sudden, cut off mid-breath. The guards ran. They found nothing but broken reeds and the smell of copper. The next morning, Greer stared at the fields from his porch. He couldn't see the workers clearly through the mist, just shapes bending and straightening. He thought he saw something white among them, but when he blinked, it was gone. Calhoun arrived 3 days later, pale and sweating. He brought guards with him, rifles gleaming, nerves raw. "Fix this," he hissed at Greer, "before word spreads, before people start talking about curses." Greer nodded, jaw locked. He would fix it all right. He'd find the ghost that haunted his land and hang it for the whole county to see. He didn't yet understand the ghost wasn't haunting him. It was hunting him. That night, Greer called Silas to his shed. He studied the man's wounds, his white flesh still healing from the sun. "You know something," Greer said. "You've seen something." Silas stared back, calm as the swamp itself. "Yes," he whispered. Greer's pulse spiked. "Then tell me." Silas's lips barely moved. "You wouldn't believe me." His voice sounded less like words and more like wind through hollow wood. Greer struck him hard enough to draw blood. Still, Silas didn't flinch. The next morning, one of Calhoun's guards was missing. His boots lay at the gate, his musket in the dirt. The print beside it wasn't a boot or paw. It looked almost human, except for the long, deep drag marks beside it. No one spoke of it. No one had to. Fear had become language now. It whispered in the rustle of reeds, hummed in the buzzing of flies. It lived in every man's heartbeat, counting down to something unseen. Greer began locking his door at night. But he knew locks were lies, too. The swamp had no need for keys. He'd hear breathing outside sometimes, slow, measured, deliberate. But when he opened the door, nothing waited there. By April, only a handful of white men remained on the plantation. The rest were names whispered once and never again. Calhoun started packing to leave, but Greer swore it would end soon. "I'll stop it," he said. "Whatever it is." But deep down, he knew he wouldn't. The swamp had chosen its own justice, and it wasn't finished. Beneath the cypress roots, where water met bone, something pale waited, patient as vengeance, silent as faith. And every night, when the wind blew from the south, the men swore they heard it whisper. Not words, not threats, just a name, soft, endless, echoing across the dark water. Silas. April's heat came early that year. The air over Burke County hung thick as syrup, the swamp buzzing like something alive. Every man on the plantation felt it, that watching, waiting wait. Greer barely slept. Each night he sat with his pistol and lamp, listening to the frogs fade whenever the wind shifted. He'd stopped trusting his own shadow. Even it seemed ready to betray him. Calhoun's letter from Savannah arrived that morning. Short, formal, panicked. Handle it quietly. No records, no sheriff. Words of a man who feared scandal more than death. Greer folded it with bloody hands. 3 new overseers rode in before dusk, Sloan, Dodd, and Fletcher, All young, eager, hard-eyed. They smelled like sweat, horses, and whiskey courage. Greer welcomed them like brothers and lied through his teeth. He told them of missing staff, blamed swamp fever and negligence, spoke with rehearsed calm. But his eyes gave him away. They twitched whenever the cypress groves were mentioned, like memory cutting through his mask. That night, Greer poured whiskey for them all. "Simple rules," he said. "Never walk alone, never go near the grove after dark." The men laughed. Dodd even raised his glass. "You afraid of ghosts, old man?" Greer's grin didn't reach his eyes. "No," he said softly. "I'm afraid of what ghosts used to be." Silence swallowed the laughter after that. Only the cicadas dared speak. Silas watched from the shadows outside. His skin caught the moonlight, pale against the dark trees. His back still burned from old lashes, the wounds half healed, half open. Pain was nothing new. Patience was older. By morning, Sloan was gone. His bed unslept, his lamp still burning. Dodd found the print of a hand on the wall, a white, wet hand smeared with something that smelled faintly of iron. Greer didn't shout this time. He just stood on the porch, staring toward the trees. His jaw worked, grinding the words he wouldn't say. "He's still here," he muttered. "And he's not done." They searched again. Dodd led. Fletcher followed, torches bobbing like fireflies over the marsh. The enslaved men dragged through mud and fear, each step slower than the last. Every sound made them flinch. They found the clearing by accident, a patch of dry land ringed by cypress trunks like prison bars. The air felt wrong, too still, too warm, carrying the faint stink of rot and tanning hide. Something hung from the trees, 9 somethings. Pale, stretched, swaying in the breeze. For a heartbeat, no one breathed. Then Fletcher stumbled forward and screamed. Human skin, full bodies, faces intact, hands like wax. Greer's world tilted. He recognized one face, Wade Parsons. That scar on the forearm, that grin, now frozen in horror. He tasted bile. "Dear God," Dodd whispered, "what kind of man does this?" Greer's voice cracked when he answered. "Not a man." He stepped closer, eyes wide, pistol trembling. "Not anymore." The skins stirred slightly, like something beneath them still breathed. The swamp exhaled. Fletcher dropped his torch. Flames licked at the grass, but the damp ground refused to burn. Smoke rose anyway, gray, thick, and strange. It smelled like chemicals, like old tanneries. Then came the whisper. No direction, no tone. Just words carried on air that shouldn't have been able to speak. "You took the flesh," it said. "Now I take it back." Dodd shouted and fired into the trees. The blast echoed, scattering birds. Nothing else moved. Greer's heart hammered. "Back to the house," he hissed. "Now!" But even as they turned, he saw movement. Pale, slow, inevitable. Silas stepped from the shadows, shirtless, eyes ghost blue. The light caught the blade in his hand. His voice was calm, quiet. "You kept their skins," he said. "I just taught the lesson." Dodd lifted his rifle. "Stay where you are." His voice cracked halfway through. Silas tilted his head, not in defiance, but almost pity. "You don't belong here," he murmured. "Not in this place, not in this world." He moved faster than they expected. A blur through mist. The knife flashed once. Dodd fell without sound, throat open, blood painting the reeds. Fletcher screamed, stumbled back, and fired blind into the smoke. Greer shot next, his bullet ripping bark where Silas had been. "Stop!" he shouted, though it sounded more like prayer than order. The swamp swallowed the sound whole. Only the water answered. The torches guttered out. The grove went black. In that darkness, men heard footsteps circling, deliberate and close, breathing, low and steady, the kind that knew it didn't need to run. Fletcher broke first. He bolted, crashing through water and roots. Greer followed, pistol shaking, breath ragged. The darkness moved with them, whispering his name like a promise. Greer, soft, endless, patient. When Greer tripped, the mud caught him hard. His lamp shattered. The world blinked to red. Something cold brushed his cheek. A voice spoke near his ear. "You like silence," it said. "Now live in it." He fired blindly, once, twice, nothing. Only the splash of footsteps retreating or circling, he couldn't tell. His ears rang. The air thickened with heat and the iron smell of blood. By dawn, Greer stumbled back to the main house covered in swamp muck. Dodd and Fletcher were gone. Sloan gone. The skin still hung in the grove, untouched by light. And Silas, nowhere. Calhoun found him trembling on the porch. "What happened?" he demanded. Greer looked up, eyes hollow. "He's making them into ghosts," he said, "and soon he'll come for me." Calhoun didn't answer. There was nothing left to say. The plantation that once fed on human lives now fed on fear alone. The swamp watched, silent, knowing it wasn't finished. That night, thunder rolled over Burke County. Rain pounded the roofs, washing the blood away. In the grove, the skins swayed gently, rainwater streaking down pale faces like tears that weren't theirs. And somewhere beneath that storm, Silas whispered his own prayer. It wasn't to God. It was to memory, to pain, to the dead men who'd finally found peace inside his vengeance. The rain had stopped by morning, but the air still carried its ghost. The plantation lay hushed beneath gray skies, its fields slick with water, its men hollow-eyed and waiting for something unseen. Calhoun sat in his study, the rifle across his knees, the letter to Savannah half-finished. His handwriting shook. Every word looked like confession. The ink bled where sweat had fallen. He hadn't slept in days. Outside, the few remaining guards paced nervously. Each footstep echoed against the wet boards. The dogs wouldn't bark anymore. They just whined low and hid beneath the porches, afraid of something they couldn't name. Greer leaned against the window, staring toward the swamp. He hadn't spoken since returning from the grove. His face looked carved from bone, his eyes fever bright. "He's still out there," he whispered. "Waiting." Calhoun snapped. "You'll stop talking like that. We're men, not children." But the words lacked conviction. Even he could feel it. That heavy stillness pressing down on everything that breathed. The silence had teeth now. They sent riders for help before noon. One never returned. The other came back after nightfall, face pale as flour. He said he'd heard voices on the road calling his name in Silas's voice. Greer loaded his pistol again. His hands shook so badly he dropped a bullet. "He ain't human," he said. "Ain't flesh and bone no more. We made something else." No one argued. There was nothing left to deny. The enslaved men stayed in their quarters. They whispered about the Pale One, the man the swamp had claimed. Some said he'd become its spirit. Others said he'd just remembered what freedom tasted like. At sunset, the air changed again. Wind rose from the south, warm and wrong. The swamp seemed to breathe, exhaling fog that curled along the ground, swallowing fences and footsteps alike. Greer stood on the porch, staring into that mist. "He's coming," he muttered. Calhoun's voice cracked. "You don't know that." Greer's eyes stayed fixed on the trees. "I do." He cocked his pistol. "Because he promised." When darkness fell, the lamps went out one by one. The guards cursed, fumbling for matches, but the oil wouldn't catch. The night refused to burn. Only the sound of slow, wet footsteps drew closer. Then silence. Greer held his breath. Something brushed the side of the house. Gentle, deliberate. He fired through the wall. The echo rolled through the fields. When it died, another sound followed. Laughter. It wasn't loud, just a soft chuckle, the kind a man gives when he's already won. Greer's knees weakened. He turned toward Calhoun. "He's here," he said. "And he's not alone." A figure appeared in the doorway, barefoot, shirtless, soaked in rain and blood, skin white as death, eyes burning blue through the dark. Silas stood silent, the knife still red in his hand. "Stay back," Calhoun stammered, lifting his rifle. Silas didn't move. "Why?" he asked quietly. "You shoot slaves, not men. You don't know how to fight those who look you in the eye." His voice was calm, terrible. Greer raised his pistol and fired. The shot tore through Silas's shoulder, spinning him slightly, but he didn't fall. He just turned slowly, eyes locked on Greer's face. "You took my skin once," he said. "Now I take yours." He moved faster than thought. The knife flashed, and Greer's gun clattered to the floor. He gasped once, eyes wide, then dropped to his knees. Silas caught him by the throat, whispering something only the dying could hear. Calhoun backed away, tripping over a chair. He raised his rifle with shaking hands. "You can't kill me," he choked. "You need me. I own this place." Silas smiled. "You own nothing. The earth does." The shot thundered. Calhoun fell backward, shoulder torn open. His scream barely rose above the storm outside. Silas stepped closer, the mud dripping from his feet. "Now you know how it feels to bleed for work." Outside, the enslaved men gathered in the rain. They didn't cheer or move forward. They just watched as the main house glowed with firelight from within. No one tried to stop what was happening. When the flames finally caught, the roof cracked open. Smoke poured into the gray sky, thick and bitter. Through it, a figure walked out, pale, limping but upright. Silas. He didn't look back. Calhoun crawled out moments later, dragging one arm, coughing blood. He shouted for help, but the men stayed still. They had learned silence from Silas. It was the only weapon they had left. Greer never came out. His body was found days later near the grove, skin peeled and nailed to a tree. The soldiers who buried him wouldn't speak of what they saw. Some left Georgia that same week. Silas vanished into the swamps. Some said he died from his wounds. Others swore they saw him months later, walking through the marsh at dawn, eyes glowing like lanterns beneath the mist. Calhoun's plantation rotted. No man would take the land. The house burned again years later, this time with no fire set. Locals claimed the cypress grove whispered whenever the wind came from the south. Years passed, but the story grew. Men told it in taverns, soldiers whispered it in camps. They said a pale figure walked the Georgia swamps, punishing cruelty with silence, trading sin for skin. By 1890, the grove was avoided entirely. Loggers refused to cut there. They said their axes rusted overnight, their saws dulled for no reason. Some heard laughter in the trees. Quiet, knowing, familiar. In 1912, a surveyor found old human bones near the riverbank. Most were small, unmarked, but one skull still had the remnants of pale hair clinging to it, untouched by decay. He left it where it lay. Men forgot names, but not the legend. They called him Devil's White, the slave who became vengeance, the man who turned silence into justice. He was the scream history never dared to write down. Sometimes, under a full moon, fishermen swore they saw him, a lone figure standing waist-deep in black water, still as death, watching the world that forgot him. And when they blinked, he was gone. The swamps grew wild again. Nature took what was owed. No overseers, no chains, only the ghosts of those who thought themselves untouchable, their voices now part of the endless breathing dark. Silas's name became warning and prayer. Fathers whispered it to sons who raised their hand too quick, too cruel. "Remember the White One," they said. "He waits in silence." And so, through the fog and centuries, his legend endured, not as a monster's tale, but a reckoning. Proof that even the quietest man could roar loud enough to shake the world. Because vengeance doesn't vanish. It sleeps beneath the mud, patient, eternal. And somewhere in the cypress grove of Burke County, Georgia, the wind still murmurs one name, low, reverent, unending: Silas.